And let me just jump in and ask Cara to start us out by saying, it's interesting that the acting controller's speech made the point again, which almost every single senior principal has made, that we're not going to tell you who to lend to and who not to lend to. But your bank, like many others, has made net zero commitments. So how should banks be thinking about this in the changed world and in light of the commitments you've made?
It's a great opening question, and it's great to be here. I think where I'll start is sort of to double click on this complexity that you mentioned, because I think that is really critical. We all know that we're in the midst of a very complicated energy crisis, but just to add a little bit of detail to some of the other forces that are also underway, I think is really important, because that ultimately informs how we approach this as a financial institution. It's clear that energy price volatility is very high. We've seen incredible price spikes in things like oil. European countries are discussing things like price caps, and we've seen, countries spending close to 4% of GDP just on, the ability to offset recent price increases. Really importantly, though, a scale up to renewables very quickly is quite hard, as we've seen. So a lot of supply chain challenges. We've seen the price of lithium from January of last year, increase almost 700%. Cobalt has doubled. These are really critical inputs to low carbon solutions. We know that there were challenges over the summer last year, in the winter, in terms of storage. A lot of things I should mention that are being addressed in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is, I think, really important. But just to add to the complexity, this isn't something we can just turn on and off overnight. We also know, and we've seen this in recent weeks, that energy transition long-term really is critical to get right. So we've seen, the physical impacts of climate change in a really significant way. Just in the past couple days, we've seen a stage 3 emergency in California. We saw earlier in August, China shut down its factories. Really importantly, again, this is the complexity. During a 60-year record heat wave in the Sichuan province, a lot of the factories that were actually shut down produce solar panels, semiconductor solar panels. So just to kind of show you the decisions that are having to be made in all of these trade-offs. Rainfall in Pakistan was 500% of average in some areas recently, and we've seen devastating impacts. So I think ultimately, what we're really in the middle of is an acknowledgement that providing a balanced energy supply that is reliable, affordable, and clean is the long-term goal. It's important for national security, as you mentioned. It's important for balanced energy supply and affordability, but it's going to be a journey that we're on, and it's certainly complex. From a bank perspective, it's going to really take two things, and I think this really gets at your question. Just given that complexity, is an area where actually banks are quite, are well positioned and have a lot of experience navigating complexity. Two things are really going to be required. One is a significant scale up in investment in capital. I think that's really critical. We estimate that investment need as anywhere from 100 to 150 trillion by 2050, so really significant amount. And a lot of that investment is going to need to go into the hardest to abate sectors of the economy. The second is providing tools and capabilities to measure alignment and measure risk. And this is a topic we're going to talk about at length today. But I think those are really, think of those as sort of the two most important value drivers that we as financial institutions can provide on this journey, given the complexity. Also really important to acknowledge that this is going to take engagement across all sectors of the economy. There's been a lot of debate on ESG in the past couple of weeks and months. I'll just say that one of the things that has been really important to us at Goldman Sachs is not defining energy transition as good or bad sectors. This isn't about green being good and brown necessarily being bad. It's actually understanding that many of the hard to abate carbon intensive sectors today are the ones that are going to need to scale up investment most over the medium to longer term. So I think that's a really critical point. Within the firm, we've developed a lot of capabilities around this, and I think the really kind of core thing that we've thought about is how do we help support clients across the business on decarbonization to be able to scale up that investment, but also to bring the tools and capabilities to measure alignment and risk. And one thing that two kind of very specific things that we've done to address this sort of complexity and execution and investment capital is we formed a cross-divisional sustainable banking group, which actually provides advice and capital on decarbonization. We met with 150 clients last year just on this topic. We've also developed tools and capabilities within our marquee platform in trading to actually measure the carbon footprint of clients' equity and fixed income positions. So I think those two are kind of very specific areas that help to address how you actually measure, manage, and then invest. And from a climate risk perspective, we have advanced our methodologies to measure both physical and transition risk on our business. And some of that has to do with actually developing or leveraging open source models like global circulation models, for example, to be able to assess how climate variables, some of which we've seen in recent weeks, how those may evolve over time. And very importantly, that requires looking and stressing at lots of different levels and different ranges. And then to test transition risk, we look at integrated assessment models as a foundation, on top of which we then also apply internal tools and methods. I think that the kind of two core points that I'd leave you with, specifically to answer your question on how this really has all changed. One is, given the complexity as a financial institution, integration is a key component of how we approach climate writ large and how we view the most meaningful impact and role, the execution of that most meaningful impact and role that we're going to play in energy transition, again, which is providing investment capital, providing advice, and effectively monitoring and managing risk. It's very unique to actually, as a financial institution, be in a position where you are assessing your own portfolio for climate risk, and that actually can be additive and helpful to your clients who are in the process of executing on a net zero commitment and measuring their climate alignment, for example, and vice versa. So I think that integration component is really important. We can talk about what that looks like in practice at length, but I think that is one of the things that has really evolved. This is a really cross-cutting activity across the firm with overarching governance that cuts across really both the commercial capabilities and the risk management and monitoring. And I think that the second is the ability to really identify and then work hard to address gaps in the broader ecosystem, whether that's through engagement, with my colleagues up here on the stage today, or whether that is working with partners like development banks or nonprofits to be able to address things like data gaps and challenges. But when you are actually going through, again, this practice yourself, wearing two hats as a financial institution managing this, and then also being in a position of partnering with clients, I think that gives you very good perspective on where some of the challenges lie.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. So it's interesting, the acting comptroller made the point about how the muscle memory of stress testing may impact scenario analysis under climate risk, and we saw the Bank of England study, which was very interesting. Kevin, I think you're working with Basel and working on some of the thinking that's going through on capital and how it might relate to climate risk. Do you want to comment on that or on stress testing?
Well, maybe I'll talk a little bit about the broader agenda of the Basel Committee's task force on climate-related financial risks. In my remarks today, I am speaking in the capacity as the co-chair of the task force on climate-related financial risks that the Basel Committee put in place about 2 years ago. I co-chair that with Frank Elderson from the ECB. The committee acknowledged that physical and transition risks are important safety and soundness issues for globally, internationally active banks, and really has made this a strategic priority going forward to think about how the Basel framework would reflect these financial risks of climate change. And to be really clear about what the purpose and what the goal is, this is all through the lens of thinking about the resilience of these large internationally active banks, and not through the lens of using regulatory or supervisory policy to achieve broader climate policy objectives. So with that focus, we really tried to take a very measured, sequential approach. First doing the analytical work to understand what the issues were around transmission channels, to think about materiality, and then move on to a more normative perspective about what an appropriate policy response might be. One of the key findings from that original analytical work, and these were 2 papers that we published in April of 21, were some of the issues that have already been raised, that Cara has raised around the complexity of the transition, the uncertainty around it, the range of potential plausible outcomes, questions around the data that is necessary to try to measure some of these new risks, the need for models, and conceptually just thinking about the underlying fact that these risks are forward-looking in the sense that the distribution of future shocks could be very different from what we've observed in the past on the physical risk side. And we're thinking about a transition to potentially a different organizational structure of the economy. And that's a different kind of change that banks have to work through. So with that in mind, the Basel Committee then thought about what might we think about from a policy perspective. And given all this complexity, given all this uncertainty, the committee instructed us on the task force to really try to take a holistic approach and think across all 3 pillars of the Basel framework. The regulatory piece, the supervisory piece, and the disclosure piece, and think about what steps might be taken to try to ensure that firms are resilient to the financial risks of climate change. So let me talk just for a minute about each of those 3 pillars within the Basel framework and the work that's underway. On the Pillar 1 front, we are assessing whether there are any gaps within the Basel framework, gaps in particular tied to those challenges that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the distinctive attributes of the financial risks of climate change that could be linked to the uncertainty, the complexity, the data modeling gaps, the forward-looking nature of the risk. So this work is underway. There's no pre-commitment to any potential Pillar 1 change. We're just doing the work at this point. In terms of Pillar 3 around disclosure, I think it's absolutely critical from a market discipline perspective for investors and counterparties and stakeholders to have the appropriate information to think about how to assess risks at financial institutions. As you all know, there's a lot of work on disclosure topics happening internationally. The Basel Committee has been very clear that they're supportive of the ISSB and the work that's underway, trying to think about a global standard for disclosure that would have appropriate consistency, comparability, reliability of data that would make disclosure effective. Interoperability is another key issue, thinking about how investors and stakeholders can use information in a consistent way. We heard a little bit about harmonization earlier in the session this morning. And again, that Pillar 3 work is underway. And then the third piece, the Pillar 2 work around supervisory issues, we began with an assessment of the Basel core principles and asked whether or not they were sufficiently flexible, sufficiently general to incorporate some of these unique attributes of the financial risks of climate change. And as we went through that exercise, we thought it would be appropriate, and the Basel Committee decided to put out additional information around principles for the effective management and supervision of climate-related risks. This document came out in June of this year, and it outlined, I think, what are really core risk management principles about how the financial risks of climate change can be incorporated into the existing risk management structure of large internationally active banks. We tried to take a principles-based approach, and that was for a couple of reasons. Probably most important was this ongoing balance that I think we have to try and keep in mind, that the goal is to push the frontier forward, to improve practices at these banks, to set some sort of common baseline in terms of expectations. At the same time, however, this is an emerging field. I think we are all on the steep part of the learning curve in the sense that firms are innovating, supervisors are innovating, and there's a need to have flexibility that reflects this innovation, that reflects the ongoing evolution of data, models, ability to manage, or identify and model and then manage these risks. So that led to this principles-based approach that came out in June.
So Kevin, can I ask you a question? I think it's very interesting. And we got to get to the data, which is going to be super interesting. But you know, the DFS came out with something on risk management, risk governance in 2020. We've got OCC proposed guidance, and we've got the Basel guidance. Any difference? They all seem the same to me.
So I can talk about the Basel Committee. I think Jonathan can talk about
Sure.
what the OCC has done. I think they're broadly consistent because the principle.
Which is a good thing. Which is a good thing.
So just to maybe wrap up a little bit on where things stand, these principles are out as final documents. We went through a comment period. We got a large number of comments, and I think it's fair to say there was a wide range of views about what those types of principles should incorporate. One of the challenges with this, and one of the reasons I think for the range of views, is because different supervisory authorities, different central banks, do have different mandates when it comes to climate change. And that's the lens that one has to look through. So the Basel Committee's work was focused on the resilience of these large banks and not maybe the broader mandate that specific other jurisdictions might have.
Oh, that's very interesting. Thank you. So Graham, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, which puts very firmly on the table, and I know it builds on the earlier act, the sense of Congress and the Biden administration about where we need to go. So my husband bought an electric vehicle last month. He's very keen on getting carbon neutral, and after 2 weeks he took it back. Because it would only charge up to 60% overnight, and he decided it was too stressful and too anxiety-ridden. He's 69, and he was like, I have to calculate every trip, and I have to depend upon, am I on the highway, not on the highway? Is it mountainous, is it not mountainous? Am I using the air conditioning, not using the air conditioning? And he's like, it's too much stress.
Uh-huh.
And so we really want to help, but in some ways the tech isn't there.
Right.
Inflation reduction.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just say, as an EV owner myself, I have a 2019 Bolt, and I would say everyone, if you're worried about those sorts of calculations, move to California. They have great EV infrastructure. You can stop in at a winery. They have charging stations. You can do a long road trip. It's a nice way to break up the whole flow. So I think more folks that move to California, the more would solve some of
That would solve it. Got it.
The infrastructure is a serious problem, and there's funding in some of the prior legislation to try to deal with making some of those issues a little bit more manageable for folks and build out charging stations and things like that. But on IRA specifically, and I know there's a lot of people now furiously reading the legislation to understand what the various pieces are in there around clean energy manufacturing and some of the climate provisions. And so it's $369 billion in investments in climate and clean energy for consumers and businesses. And the lion's share of that is actually within Treasury's remit through some form of tax credit program of one sort or another. And so what do those things do? One thing is that they are sending a signal that now the long-term policy of the federal government is committed to clean energy manufacturing and to the net zero transition and investing in that. So that's point number one. This is a long-term policy program. Point number two is these credits deepen and also expand a lot of these prior programs. An example that I will give you is now in some of the tax credits. Some of them are now eligible, instead of tax credits, to be direct payments. What does that do? It lets governments that don't file taxes actually get payments for making some of these investments. Nonprofits that want to do some of this work can now actually get direct payments from the government because they don't also, they are not-for-profit entities. And so that is point number two, is trying to think through where are the areas where there are incentives to do some of these things and what we do to plus up to make some of these programs more robust. So that's number two. Number three is, it is an investment throughout the entire manufacturing value chain. So it is not just if you buy a solar panel, it is if you're manufacturing the solar panel, if you were doing certain kinds of mining and development projects that go into the solar panel. So it is not just thinking about starting with the end user and trying to reverse engineer backwards. It is making investments at every level to try to incentivize everyone that can come to the table here in the transition to do so.
And how much of that is going to come back to the U.S. in terms of manufacturing?
Well, I think
Unfair question, but
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
from
yeah.
the Midwest, so I...
Sure, yeah, I mean that is the goal. I mean, so, you know, the EV tax credit that is in there is for domestically manufactured EVs. So that is one of the points too here, is a domestic supply chain rebuild at the same time that we are moving towards clean energy. So what does this all mean for market participants when they're looking at all of this? The point here is, from the federal government side, we are committed. The net zero transition is here now, and I will just tell you that based on the $369 billion alone, independent assessments say that that makes realistic now the president's commitment to have our nation's emissions by 2030. It makes it realistic. We're not there, but we are now back in the realm of being a leader at the international stage in terms of climate investments. Now, I said this is $369 billion. You heard Kara a minute ago saying we need $130 trillion to actually do this. So this is a pittance compared to what actually needs to be done in the decades to come in order to actually finance this stuff. So point number 4 is we need to work with you all. Number 1, on these programs, we need you to come to the table and invest now that the incentives are there for market participants to do this work. But also, we want to talk to you about implementation, how to make these things work in the way that makes the most sense and makes them usable. And then also other sorts of ancillary technical assistance issues. I talked about the tax credits. There's a green bank that EPA is going to be administering. There's a loan guarantee program at the Department of Energy. There are also legacy financing programs, which I can get into later as we talk more about where Treasury is going with some of these things. So how do we make all of these different programs set up at different agencies that are all supposed to be financing different parts of the clean energy value chain? How can we make them coherent and fit together so that private capital actually wants to come in here and invest in the things we want them to invest in order to move towards the transition? So
and
that's how
makes the batteries better, and then my husband will be able to handle the EV.
Absolutely.
Right.
You can drive 400 miles instead
Right.
of 280 miles if you charge to 80% or whatever
Yeah,
it is.
that's just so interesting. Jonathan, let me ask you a question, kind of going on the flip side before we do our deeper dive on data and methodology. There's a lot of legislation happening in what I'll call red and blue states, right? And we all know what Texas and West Virginia have done, and there's a bunch of Republican attorney generals who are out there using that as a pattern card. Our memo that's up on the table there has a handy dandy little map, color-coded to tell you who's doing what. And of course, you've got New York and California and others doing legislation the other way. I think these statutes have been very, very cleverly drawn so that the magic of national bank preemption looks very difficult to me. What, at the OCC, what are you thinking about in terms of those fair access laws? And, what's your sense of where that's going to go?
Great question, Meg. And I know this is an area that's of keen interest to you. Let me just start by saying, initially, my focus over the last 6 months while I've been in the acting climate risk officer role at OCC has been on risk management. That's our focus on climate risk. I've not been lawyering the last 6 months. I've left that to my law department colleagues. But I'm happy to jump back into that briefly. Just don't tell my law department colleagues that I'm doing it. So we're familiar with the issue that you raised, Meg. I think this isn't a workshop, and we won't look at a model statute and tease that apart. If you were advising clients, you would of course want to look at the statute. But I think I can make some general observations on the applicability of these laws. Perhaps perhaps it's useful to think of 2 different categories of state enactment. So one might be a state statute that's directed to state governmental entities, that acts on those entities and says, when you're contracting with companies, you shall not contract with a company that engages with a certain industry or refuses to do so. Those generally, as a general proposition, would not appear to raise federal preemption issues in terms of the banking laws. Those laws act on state governmental entities, not the private sector. So I think with that category of state law, which you'll see out there, it doesn't seem to be an obvious interaction. So that's one category. A second category might be state enactments that act on corporations, on companies, may be defined in such a way as not to exclude banks, and the state law might say that the company is prohibited from engaging in business with particular industries or engage or refuse to engage. Now, many of those laws have exceptions for based on business and financial reasons. So there's a carve out from the prohibition. And I think as a general matter at a staff level, our staff's view, our legal staff's view has been that where there is such an exception, given the power of federally chartered national banks, federal savings associations to assess risk and to decide to whom they lend and with whom they transact, that where there is that exception broadly stated in the state statute, that would mean that there would not be an obvious interaction preemption issue. Where you have the obvious question then, Jonathan, you're all asking, is what about a state enactment that fails to have that exception? And there I think you do end up back where I started with needing to look at the text of the statute, and really that would be a case-by-case analysis in the absence of that exception, state by state, statute by statute, provision by provision, as we often do when we're engaged in a preemption analysis. So those are some observations from a non-lawyering lawyer.
There's going to be some whiplash, I think, back and forth, although maybe the Inflation Reduction Act is a game changer. Let's get to data and methodology, and maybe Kevin, you and Kara might talk about that a little bit, because I had a sense that you had more you wanted to say, Kevin. But what, if there were, we've decided we're not going to talk about the SEC disclosure rule here on this panel, because there's nobody from the SEC here, and because there's been enough hand-wringing about that among already. But in terms of the risk management, in terms of where you're trying to go, in terms of the investment that needs to be made, what's the data that's missing? What do you wish you had? And I'll let Kevin and Kara chat back and forth with each other on that.
So as part of our work at the Basel Committee's task force, we had a lot of engagement with internationally active banks, US banks, international banks. And it was incredibly valuable to talk to the institutions, both to hear their challenges and also to see, in a practical sense, where firms were investing. And I think the good news is that there was a massive amount of investment going on internally in terms of capacity building. We saw that in terms of organizational changes within firms, in terms of bringing on new skill sets and new expertise, new data, new modeling capabilities. Some of the data that firms are using is incredibly granular, much more granular than what we've seen in other sorts of credit assessments. No longer enough to know the balance sheet or the cash flow of a borrower. You want to know the geophysical location of every asset of the borrower to be able to make an assessment of their potential vulnerability to physical risk. So that's the kind of investment that we see firms making. We also see governance and governance structures changing, and this integration between, say, a risk management perspective and more of a corporate social responsibility perspective as firms are thinking about their broader strategy, and both of those are core parts as firms. And this is all what we've heard from the internationally active firms. Another point that comes up quite a bit, and I'm sure Kara can talk more about this, is firms are thinking about climate change both from a risk management perspective, but also from a strategic opportunities perspective, and how do they want to position their business forward.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that a little bit, I mean, if you think about the goals that we've set out as an organization around energy transition and climate, it's a few things. One is we have a significant opportunity target. So we have a $750 billion commitment to finance, invest, and advise in energy transition and inclusive growth by 2030. We have a robust risk program that I talked about, a climate risk program where we need to assess, monitor, and then ultimately, report on our approach to climate risk management. So we have TCFD reporting, our climate risk reporting that we produce every year. And I want to emphasize the reporting component because we don't need to talk about the SEC rule, but I do think for us as a firm and for a lot of our clients, there's a lot of energy and cost and resourcing that is put into reporting on sustainability today. I spent almost 10 years before this seat in investor relations at Goldman Sachs and really built our sustainability reporting over the course of many years. And I mean, this is run the way that we run a 10K process, right? In terms of the data that goes into it, the review, the quality, it's very resource intensive.
And similar disclosure controls in government? Exactly. So very resource intensive. So I do think we need to be really thoughtful around, it's always helpful to be transparent and have information out there, but I do think we need to be quite thoughtful around the phasing and the resourcing involved when we are thinking about public disclosure, because it is quite a significant compliance and reporting burden. So I think that's an important kind of pillar and piece to acknowledge on this. In terms of climate goals, we also have a net zero commitment, as you mentioned earlier. Upwards of 2/3 of global GDP is now represented by private sector net zero commitments. So many of our clients also have net zero commitments. They have different ranges, they have different interim goals, but really importantly, there's a lot of data that they ultimately need and that we need for our own sectoral commitments. We have 3 midterm targets that we've set for power, oil and gas, and auto manufacturing. We do need data to be able to track and monitor and then report on that. So I think, as Kevin mentioned, there's a lot of investment that has been made in that information. Some of it is publicly available, so it's just getting it, into the firm and making sure that you have the right controls to be able to review it. And then of course, smaller mid-cap companies, the disclosure is definitely less. So there are public companies out there that are not disclosing scope 1 and scope 2 information as well. So there are certainly data gaps, if you will. But I think, we're not surprised that there's data gaps. I think we need to just be mindful that this is a little bit of a journey. The last piece I'll just say, not specific to data, but I do think I just want to build on something Graham said, because I do think it's really important just to acknowledge that part of our ability to accelerate our investment, which we know is critical to energy transition, I mean, this is the whole premise behind the Inflation Reduction Act, is signaling and being able to get more investment in. It really is around how we can drive a more commercially viable energy transition. And there are the 100 to 150 trillion estimate. There's some estimates that are lower, some that are higher. 50% of that. What's the time frame for that?
By 2050. By 2050. About 50%, we estimate that about 50% of that investment needs to go into low carbon solutions that are not yet at commercial scale. So not yet market rates of return without an incentive effectively. Now there's ways that you can achieve investment, through innovation, procurement. So there are things that we've done with partners like Northvolt, for example, which is a lithium-ion battery producer, where we brought in VW to be able to sort of lock in a guaranteed procurement, and that helped them to reduce the cost of production and ultimately be able to scale up. There's things that you could do within the private sector, but really where a lot of that scale is going to come is when that cost can be reduced further. And there's a lot that's in the Inflation Reduction Act that I think we're quite hopeful will do that. Some of those technologies like carbon capture or like green hydrogen or like sustainable aviation fuel, I mean, those are really that sort of 50% bucket that ultimately needs to
And carbon
be able to
capture, yeah,
scale.
absolutely. So a lot of investment and a lot of needs for data. Jonathan, today, the acting controller said there's going to be, a risk officer at the OCC. What's happening on the regulatory side? It seems like there needs to be, personnel and talent is one thing, skill sets, but it seems like there's going to need to be a lot of technological investment by the regulators in their own systems to be able to measure and monitor. And I don't know, Graham, if the Inflation Reduction Act has any budget for the banking regulators, but how are you all as regulators preparing for almost your own risk management, your own tools and methodology, your own talent? Jump ball for anybody.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in initially and turn to my colleagues, but I mean, I think that's right. We're aware of the need for investment. Mike Sue mentioned this morning we're elevating our climate risk function, creating an office directly reporting to him. We'll be announcing the Chief Climate Risk Officer selectee shortly. Building out that office, we're developing internal expertise across supervision. We've set up an internal climate risk implementation committee, which is part of our national risk committee structure, which feeds into our policy making at the OCC. A lot of great engagement. Kevin's talked about the Basel work. Also bilateral communications with other jurisdictions, some of which made an earlier start in this area, have been really helpful. So engagement through the FSOC as well. So there's just this is a complex area technically, as we've said, but also there's complexity just in the way that we need to approach the underlying issues and how we structure ourselves. But it's critical that we do so. That's why we've at the OCC we've elevated the function, and we'll continue to build that out. And as we sort of build the plane as you fly it, with many endeavours, we'll be continuing our supervisory program in the large banks, assessing the climate risk management frameworks.
Sounds like it's a lot of people investment, but I don't think I heard anything about technology investment.
I didn't touch on that, but you're right. There is a significant amount of that. I mean, we are engaged at the OCC in developing technological resources to support a whole gamut of areas, but those include climate risk. Climate risk is integrated into pretty much all the organic risks that we supervise. And so the resources that we're putting into our technological development there will apply across the board, including how we manage climate risk.
I would just say, the Biden administration has made clear, at least to us in the cabinet agencies, that they want a whole of government approach here. So I think what is happening in some of this space is either different agencies coming together under the FSOC and its climate-related financial risk committee. The Office of Financial Research is setting up its own climate hub pilot project to try to get more data here. Even we at Treasury, through our various offices, are trying to do work. The FSOC report called out that there needs to be more capacity building here. We're trying to contribute to this in the areas where we see that we either have expertise or capacity to do that. I'll mention the Federal Insurance Office, which I'm responsible for, which is looking both at insurers on the asset side, what their financial risk looks like, climate-related financial risk looks like. They're insurers, but they're also large asset managers at the same time, so we're hopeful that some of that work will inform any financial institution that has an investment portfolio and help them learn a little bit from that piece. We're also thinking about how we can look at the physical risk side for some of these markets. Again, if you're not an insurer, it might tell you a little bit about what the physical risk looks like that is out there in certain markets that are vulnerable to climate-related physical risks. We have an Office of Consumer Policy that's trying to map vulnerable households with climate-vulnerable communities to understand a little bit more about who's going to be impacted. So we're trying to, I think, fill some of these gaps and build capacity in areas of our respective jurisdictions that might not seem directly within a regulator's legal mandate, but actually might be relevant to some of the underlying data gaps and issues that are out there.
So I'm getting some questions to the app, and I think one of them is for you, Graham, which is, and then I think the next one is for Kevin. Although, Jonathan, you may want to jump in here. So is the new focus on auto loans as part of the retail lending test in the proposed CRA, is that consistent with the community development goals relating to pollution and climate change? I'm not a CRA expert, so I may have mixed up the question. Any views?
I'm also not a CRA. So I will probably defer on that question.
Any views from the panel? It's absolutely okay to punt.
So I will, we are not responsible for CRA, they are, we respect that these agencies are independent. One thing that I will say on the community development side is that our CDFI fund is very interested in community-related climate resilience and climate investments, and so this is actually a question that they're going to start engaging with the sector on and trying to measure a little bit better is what is the field doing right now? How do we categorize different kinds of climate investments? And then trying to actually map who is doing what are the best in class community-related climate investment practices. And then again, turn around to the sector, both the CDFI specifically, but also would love to have the GSIBs engage in some of this to think about what more can be done in terms of building community climate resilience, because that's a piece. We talked about the risks pieces, we talked about investing in the supply chain, the community resilience part is really important as well.
And I've got to, again, not speaking as an expert, but you've got to think that if there's a retail auto test and there are tax credits and various things happening with EVs, once you can make folks like my husband comfortable, maybe getting there. Here's a question. Are the banking agencies considering the need for greater alignment between the IRA's use of tax credits and the bank stress testing and capital framework? Kevin, I sense that one is for you, although Jonathan may want to weigh in.
So we haven't made any changes at the Fed in terms of what we might do in terms of climate-related scenario analysis. We haven't changed anything with regard to our stress tests. We're still considering options.
Got it. Okay, we've got 28 seconds left. Does anybody have anything you wanted to say you didn't get a chance to say?
I think the only other point I would just leave us with is a lot of what Kevin talked about I think is really important in terms of harmonization. We didn't talk about as much harmonization as much, but I will just say from the internal bank perspective, we are spending a lot of time in different jurisdictions, looking at different entities. For example, we're preparing for mandatory UK TCFD reporting next year. We need to think about how that tracks with all of our other global efforts. And so I think that's just a really important point. There's a lot of promising things like what Kevin has talked about on the Basel side there, but keep in mind there's also the reporting pieces and that efforts of NGFS are very positive as well. But I think that this is a really important component, and there's the reporting piece, there's the climate risk piece, there's a lot of different components that we need to be thinking about.
We're going to give Graham the last word.
I did want to touch on net zero for a minute. This is an area that is of great interest to us right now, and we're going to be focusing on more and more in the coming months. So we're interested in engaging with the sector a little bit more on this issue of sort of harmonization. Number one, what are the best practices that are out there? Where are there obstacles, and how can we help with trying to shake some of those obstacles loose? Then also engagement through GFANs, G20, and other bodies to try to do a little bit more of this harmonization. So we will be reaching out. We will be hopefully talking to people early and often about what is happening out there in the field to try to drive a race to the top in some of the net zero commitments.
Great way to end. Thank you very much.
Thank you.